Welcome everyone to the Badger Dairy Insight series. Today we're going to be talking about animal care starts with the calf. I'm Melissa Seefeld. I'm the dairy and livestock educator here in Eau Claire County. I'd also like to introduce a few of our work group members that have been instrumental in helping bring this meeting together. We have Sarah Grochin out of Outagamie County, Jackie McCarville out of Greene County, Tina Coleman, who's regionally based dairy and livestock educator, whose home office, I believe, is still in Fond du Lac County. We have Ashley Olson in Vernon, Erica Bierstrom in Kewaunee County, Heather Schlesser in Marathon County, Matt Lippert in Clark and Wood County, and then we also have our specialist Jennifer Van Oss, who is UW-Madison-based assistant professor and extension specialist in animal welfare, who's going to be speaking with us a little bit more this afternoon. We do have a demographic pull-up. Please fill that out for us. We'd sure appreciate that. A reminder, we do have this series set for a bi-weekly time frame. So we'll be meeting Tuesdays from 1 to 2:30, but every other week. And you can find information on our upcoming series at the website, the Farm Ready Research website. And if I can have one of my co-hosts drop that link in the chat, that would be super helpful. And as we go through the presentations today, do remember that we can drop our questions in the chat, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the presentations. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Jennifer Van Oss, who is an assistant professor and extension specialist in animal welfare on the faculty in the Department of Animal and Dairy Sciences at UW-Madison. Dr. Van Oss received her PhD in the interdisciplinary animal behavior graduate program at the University of California, Davis, and conducted postdoctoral research in the animal welfare program at the University of British Columbia. The research in her lab at UW-Madison focuses on understanding, evaluating, and improving the welfare of dairy animals from the biological and social science perspectives. The goal of Dr. Van Oss's extension program is to promote best practices in management and housing to help the dairy industry adapt as our scientific knowledge about animal welfare continues to grow. And so she will be talking on successfully pair raising of calves. And with that, Dr. Van Oss, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the demographic poll for now. And I just want to start out before I dive into pair raising calves about some definitions. So today's topic is how animal care starts with the calf. So we're thinking about the cow across her various life stages, and we want to start at the beginning of her life to make sure that she experiences a good quality of life throughout that lifetime. So when we say animal care, we're referring to all the different things that we as humans provide and do for our animals. And so this can include the housing and environments that we provide for them, the management practices and husbandry practices that we use, and the direct way that we interact with them and handle them. And then all of these different inputs that we give the animals are animal care, and these lead to the various outcomes that the animals experience and express. So that can be animal welfare, which includes health and other factors, as well as outcomes like growth and development. So any of these outcomes can range on a spectrum from poor outcomes to good outcomes or somewhere in between. And obviously we want to promote good outcomes whenever possible. And then for some additional context, the current state of our industry is that individual housing is the norm. And this started a little over half a century ago with an innovation out of UW-Madison, what is now UW-Madison Extension. And so this is a page that's taken from the history of the Marshfield Agricultural Research Station, where what became the modern calf hutch was developed, starting out as wood structures. Now we're more familiar with these plastic structures we see throughout the Midwest. And what I'm highlighting here is where there's small text on the page. It says, the calf hutch was developed out of necessity. And the necessity at that time in the 1960s was a crisis with calf health. And so housing calves individually allowed for separation between animals to limit disease transmission, but also individual monitoring for health and for feeding. So there are reasons why this practice became so widespread. And in today's industry, that continues to be the case. So the USDA has found that approximately 3/4 of calves nationwide are housed individually. And we found similar data when we did a survey a couple of years ago. So a group of us from UW-Madison Extension did an online survey, and we were very grateful that over 400 dairy producers and calf raisers responded. So just for some context, what I'm showing you here is a heat map of where our respondents came from on the big map. So the darker the color, the more people responded. And then the small map is where dairy farms are located. And so you can see it's not completely representative. Most of our responses are from our 4-state dairy region as well as from out east, but it gave us a good sense of what producers in our area are doing. So our results lined up pretty closely with the USDA data from a few years prior, but we wanted to ask some more specific questions about how people are managing their calves. So that's what I'm going to be sharing throughout this presentation. What we found was that the most common way of raising calves, and this is by % of farms, is individual housing outdoors. So for example, in individual calf hutches. And that was followed by individual housing indoors, which would be in a barn. And then some farms have some of their calves outdoors and some indoors. About 1/4 of farms in our study use what we call social housing or pair groups. So 14% total house their calves in pairs or small groups of 8 calves or fewer. And then 9% housed their calves in larger groups, which we're defining as more than 8 calves. So I would like to start with a poll question. So among the people who are here today, I'm just curious, how do you currently house the majority of your pre-wean heifer calves? So the possibilities are individually with solid barriers in between calves or physical space, individually with fence line contact, so calves can potentially touch each other, pairs or groups of up to 8 calves, groups of more than 8 calves, or some other kind of system. So occasionally we have people who do dam rearing or nurse cow rearing or some other system altogether. Just give it another few seconds here. Okay. So the most common answer was individually with solid barriers or space between calves, followed by individually with fence line contact where calves can touch each other. And those add up actually to roughly what we found in our survey. And then there are a few people who are housing their calves in pairs or small groups. Nobody chose groups of more than 8 calves. So this is similar to in other presentations that I've done where this is kind of the distribution. Sometimes we do get people using larger groups. So thanks for sharing that. So now I want to move on to this idea of pair group housing. What is the right social distance for calves to have? And I want to acknowledge that, again, there was a reason why the calf hutch was such a major innovation about 50 years ago. But the context that we have now in the dairy and calf rearing industry has changed. So what hasn't changed is that the newborn calf is indeed an at-risk age group for disease. Their immune systems are undeveloped. They are a vulnerable population. So that's very important to keep in mind. But what's also important to remember is that dairy cattle evolved as a social species. They're herd animals by their nature. And that means that having some companionship with others of their kind is very important for their welfare. So health is part of welfare, but there's other aspects we also need to consider to make sure that our animals are experiencing a good quality of life. We're already seeing signs worldwide that lead us to believe that this norm is going to shift sometime in the future, away from raising calves individually, which is the majority now, towards pair group housing becoming more of a norm. And so this isn't something that I'm making up. I don't think it's just wishful thinking. There are already a lot of signs that this is happening. So one example that I have here is from overseas. Tesco is a grocery chain in the UK. And this headline from a couple of years ago says that they have banned single calf housing for their dairy supplier farms. And so there's a little bit of a misrepresentation by the reporter here. It wasn't about hutches themselves, it was about individual housing. And so this grocery chain made this commitment, and I think that this is just emblematic of a trend that can happen elsewhere. On the sidebar of this particular article, it's hard to read, but this news source called out that there is research showing benefits of pair housing calves pre-weaning. So that's what I want to discuss momentarily. Keeping in mind that now there is a lot of research demonstrating a number of benefits to pair group housing, I do think that this will become an expectation in the industry some point in the future. So right now it's not a nationwide regulation. I don't anticipate it will be legislated the way it is in parts of Europe, but there could be grocery chains or restaurants or food service in the US who might follow suit with these patterns that we're seeing elsewhere. So in case you haven't heard of it, I wanted to let you know about something called the Calf Care and Quality Assurance Program. So this launched in 2021, and it's modeled after beef quality assurance, and it's a partnership through Beef Quality Assurance, the Farm Program, Field Quality Assurance, and the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association. So at this point, it's just a free resource guide. It was developed by a working group, including people like myself, some veterinarians, calf raisers, dairy farmers, and it reflects what we currently think are the best practices based on scientific research and what is working on farms nowadays. So it's a set of practices in this free manual, and then there are going to be self-assessment and self-training tools available similar to beef quality assurance. And one of the things I want to highlight is that in this program manual, we discuss the importance of social contact, which is the topic of today's presentation. So that's what I'm highlighting here. And pair housing in particular, as opposed to larger groups, is highlighted as something that might work for a large number of farms where you provide these benefits that come from social contact in a manageable bite-size setting. So pairs instead of large groups. So now I want to move on to what are these benefits that research has shown to pairing calves. And I'm not going to go into great detail about any of these studies, but all the citations are at the bottom. I'll include my email address at the end if you ever want to have a more in-depth discussion or know more about the research. So I'm going to be showing bullet points about the different types of benefits and just summarizing that. So we know that dairy cattle are a social species, and several studies have shown that calves are very motivated to have contact with other calves. There are ways to test how important this access is, and they will work hard to be able to get contact with another calf. And when calves are housed together, we see an increase in play behavior. And I like to say that when calves are paired or housed in groups, they learn to play with others of their kind, both literally and figuratively. So literally they play, and this is considered to be an expression of a positive welfare status. But figuratively, they also learn how to play with others nicely. So this translates into their social development. So when these calves mature, studies have found that they have a better place in the social hierarchy. So they have a higher rank and they get better access to resources. But it's not because they're more aggressive, it's because they've learned appropriate social interactions and how to communicate with others. And so this is because of this social contact leading to better social development. So that is one set of benefits. There's also research showing that these calves who are housed in pairs or groups before weaning are then more resilient to stress later on, especially during the weaning process. So this is always a stressful event, but they show this what's called social buffering effect, where they vocalize less, they show other reduced stress responses. And in part, this is thought to be because they are more adaptable to new situations. So they're more adaptable and flexible in the face of change. And so what I've highlighted here is that a number of studies have shown that these calves have better learning ability, and specifically it's learning ability and flexibility. So it's not just about learning things the first time, but dealing with change. And I think that that can sound interesting, but a little bit hard to understand the application. So I do want to talk through why learning ability matters in the context of a working dairy farm. So if we think about the life of a calf as she matures into a dairy cow, we expect them to encounter and deal with a lot of new situations and change over the course of their lifetimes. So if we picture a hypothetical dairy calf who's raised in a hutch, after weaning, typically she would move to group housing, maybe on a bedded pack. And then if she's going to be in a freestall facility as an adult, she will then have to encounter stalls for the first time. So each of these different environments has different elements and different lying surfaces, and also different sources for obtaining food and water. So maybe she ate starter grain out of a bucket, then she has to eat from a trough and eventually eat through headlocks. There's a lot of change, and the same goes for the water sources. And it's not only these housing elements, but also the feed and diet items themselves. So what they're eating changes. And studies have shown that calves who are housed in pairs and groups are called what's known as less neophobic. They're less afraid of new things. They're more willing to try. They're more able to deal with change. They'll also be regrouped throughout their lifetimes and be introduced to these different social groups. And again, we know that when they're housed in pairs and groups, it helps with their social development. And so they're more able to adapt to these kinds of changes. And then lastly, and probably most importantly from a practical perspective, the cow has to be able to do her job and to be milked. And this can especially manifest in situations like a double parlor, where the cow needs to recognize that just because things are on a different side or mirror image, it's the same concept, and they need to be adaptable to both sides. Or in an automatic milking system, they need to be able to learn how to deal with that equipment. And so this is why learning ability matters. So just wanted to take the time to point that out. There's also a third set of benefits that many studies have found, and this can help with the bottom line of the dairy or calf raising operation, which is that it translates into growth performance. So we see a pattern of increased solid feed intake pre-weaning and during weaning, as well as increased weight gains during that time period. So what I want to show next is a summary table. So this is drawn from a review paper published about 5 years ago, and then I've added in all of the studies that happened since then. So the green plus signs and the numbers indicate how many studies found an advantage to pairs or small groups, meaning 8 or fewer calves per group. The gray equal signs indicate how many studies didn't find a difference between pair or group housing and individual housing. And the red minus signs would indicate how many studies found a negative effect of pair group housing compared to individual housing. And that's for each of these measures. So dry matter intake of starter, average daily gain, and weaning body weight. So what should jump out at you is that there are no studies to date that have found a negative impact of pair group housing on these measures of growth performance. There are studies that don't find a difference, and then there are a number of studies that did find a benefit. And so this could be for a number of reasons. Sometimes there just isn't a difference that can be detected. But the pattern that we've observed across these studies is that oftentimes the plane of milk nutrition is a really important factor. And that makes sense, because if you're starting at a baseline of a generous quantity of milk and providing that high plane of nutrition, the calves can grow adequately. And then when you add pair group housing on top of that, that effect can be enhanced. So again, I want to emphasize that sometimes you won't be able to see this positive outcome, but there has never been a study showing a negative outcome. And we know that this early life growth performance matters because this can be a predictor of future productivity. So we want to start setting the calf up for success at the beginning of her life. And that's why animal care starts with the calf, and this can translate into better milk yield in the first lactation. And finally, there's another potential benefit of pair group housing, and this has to do with people instead of the calves themselves. And this is the potential for greater public acceptance or consumer confidence. And so this is a key to the sustainability of the dairy industry to ensure that we have this consumer base going forward. We know that more and more people now are interested in where their food comes from, how the animals are raised. And so there was a study done by University of Minnesota a couple of years ago. And what they did was they stood outside the Minnesota State Fair with tablets, and they asked people to take a quick survey. And they got 1,300 adults to agree. And so what they did was they showed 3 pictures in a random order to these people, and each depicted a calf housed inside a calf barn, either housed by herself in a pen, in a pair, or in a small group, to try to standardize the way these images looked. And they asked these people, how much do you agree or disagree that this is an acceptable way for dairy calves to be raised? So that's what I'll show you now. And an alarming finding was that when people saw the picture of the individually housed calf, nearly half of them said that they disagreed or strongly disagreed that this was an acceptable way to raise dairy calves. Only a third of people agreed or strongly agreed that this was an acceptable way to raise calves. And then about a fifth of people were neutral or impartial. The opposite pattern was observed when people saw the pair or group housing images. So 2/3 of people agreed or strongly agreed with pair housing, 3/4 of people agreed or strongly agreed with small group housing, and only a small percentage disagreed. And again, about 1 in 5 people didn't have a strong opinion either way, no matter which image. So these researchers also asked some open-ended questions about what did you like or dislike about each scenario? Why did you answer the way you did? And that paper has since been published. And it's the first one of its kind that shows that the way that we house calves can affect how consumers perceive the dairy industry and how much they support these practices, and therefore potentially predict how willing they are to buy our products going forward. So to kind of sum this up, there are a lot of different kinds of benefits of pairing calves that can affect the calves themselves and also potentially the long-term future of the dairy industry. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are some potential challenges as well that need to be considered if a farm is to transition to pair group housing. So some common questions are, how can a farm decide if they're at a point right now where they're ready to make this transition? And then secondly, if they want to go forward, what kinds of adjustments need to be made in housing or management to support a successful transition to pairs or groups? So the first challenge that is often discussed is in terms of health. When we're thinking about the reason why individual housing became the norm, it was to address concerns about calf health. And when we're comparing individual housing with pairs or groups, the relationship with calf health is a bit of a mixed bag. So I have a similar table here as the one I showed for growth performance. And this is just for respiratory health outcomes, not things like scours. So in this case, the pattern is reversed. You'll see there are no studies to date that found better respiratory health outcomes in pairs or groups. There are a handful of studies that found negative effects and a handful of studies that detected no differences. You'll see there's a very small number of studies and it's hard to draw conclusions. These studies are very challenging to conduct. They take large sample sizes. It's very hard to compare among them. When we look at scours, actually, there are a couple of studies that found better outcomes in pairs or groups than in individual housing. But again, it's just 2 studies. And so it's very limited. And we know that health is something complex. It's very important to consider. One of the take-home messages was that group size is a risk factor. So larger groups can be harder to manage. They're not for everyone. So if you have concerns about calf health, large groups would not be the way to start. So for farms that are looking to move towards pair group housing, we recommend taking some benchmarks before that transition. And so one of these metrics would be calf mortality rate. And we're basing this on the current Dairy Calf and Heifer Association gold standards and looking at less than 3% mortality, excluding stillbirths, which they define as between birth and 24 hours. Other studies use 48 hours, but here we're just excluding between birth and 24 hours. So you take the number of calves who died between 24 hours and 60 days of age, and then you divide that by the number of calves born per year, again, excluding those stillbirths. And so you're aiming for less than 3%. The second benchmark to look at is a measure of transfer of passive immunity. And I did want to note that the terminology recently changed. So the experts in passive transfer no longer call it passive transfer. They say transfer of passive immunity. So that's why that's there. And instead of just looking at passing and failing, they now talk about categorizing calves into ranges of the amount of transfer. So you can have excellent transfer down to poor transfer. So this would be the best way to benchmark where the different calves on your farm fall. And when we're thinking about transitioning to pair group housing, we want to really zoom in on those calves in the poor category and aim for fewer than 10% being considered to have poor transfer, and ideally even less than 5%. And that way you know that they're getting good passive transfer. This is helping them with their underdeveloped immune systems and hopefully with potential health challenges. In addition, there's some management practices to consider. So if you decide, yes, we're meeting these benchmarks, then what do we do once we're making this transition? So we have seen a lot of success stories out there. We know that there are farms today successfully raising healthy calves in pairs or groups. So in our survey that I mentioned earlier, we found that about 3/4 of producers who are currently pair group housing their calves were satisfied with their calf health outcomes. Granted, this wasn't based on these benchmarks. This was just their subjective assessment, but they were happy. But we still need to consider that there might be some adjustments in management practices before transitioning from individual to pair group housing. So for the sake of time, I won't be able to go into great detail, but it is important to remember that calf health is multifactorial, meaning there's a lot of different factors that lead to good health outcomes. So it's important to have a good protocol in place for preventive care and health monitoring, to have a good colostrum protocol to ensure these good outcomes and transfer of passive immunity, a good nutrition program, to have good practices relating to hygiene, sanitation, biosecurity, and biocontainment, to have adequate ventilation, adequate space allowing, and good quality, clean, dry bedding. And then also to practice all in, all out moves rather than adding in younger calves as newer calves leave a group after they're weaned. So I'll link to a resource at the end where we go into much more detail about these things since I can't talk about them today. The second potential challenge that people sometimes cite in terms of facing this transition is how or where are we going to house these calves? And so what I want to highlight from our survey data is that there's a large variety of strategies out there. It's not one size fits all. Group housing doesn't have to mean one thing. So oftentimes when we say group housing, people are picturing these large groups with automatic milk feeders. And in our sample, that was less than a third of farms. So there are farms that do this, but again, large groups are a risk factor for health concerns. So it's definitely not for everyone. And what we found was the most common strategy actually was housing pairs or groups indoors in a barn, but feeding them manually. So this is either some kind of individualized feeding where there's enough buckets or bottles or teat buckets for each calf to have their own feeding space, or some kind of mob feeding where there might be a trough or mob feeding system where there's a teat bucket with enough teats for all the calves in the pen or more. And so that was the most common strategy. We also found that over a quarter of farms who answered our survey are keeping their pairs or groups outside and then manually feeding them. So some farms use super hutches that are designed for group housing and had previously been more common for after weaning, but now they're using them for pre-wean calves. And then other farms are taking advantage of their existing individual hutches and then connecting them by changing the fencing in front. So now you have two calves, each with a hutch, but they can choose where to spend their time. So they can lie together inside or outside. And so that is becoming more common. And I think something that's fantastic that I observed this year at World Dairy Expo, 2021 at World Dairy Expo, is that the industry in terms of calf housing manufacturers is offering lots of housing options now for pairs and groups. And this can be inside a barn with removable panels dividing the pens, but also outside with these super hutch systems and pair housing systems. So I think it's great that now these options are being offered, but other producers can also modify their own systems. So moving on quickly, the third most common challenge that I hear when people discuss pair group housing is concerns about unwanted behaviors, especially cross-sucking. So in our survey, we found that 85% of those using pair group housing reported seeing at least occasional cross-sucking between their calves. One thing I want to highlight, though, is that as we saw with our audience today, it is quite common for people to house their calves individually, but they have fence line contact where they can touch each other. And in that case, in our survey, 70% of farms using that kind of system also saw at least occasional cross-sucking. So this isn't just limited to calves with full social contact. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of research out there about the long-term consequences of cross-sucking. So when I talk with producers, oftentimes they are hesitant to pair group house because they already have a problem with some heifers calving in with blind quarters. And they're worried that this problem could get worse if they allow full social contact. And I will say we don't have any evidence right now that there's actually a link, because we know that even individually housed calves can later cross-suck and have these problems. So more research is definitely needed, and that's something I'm interested in doing. So a couple of studies have found that cross-sucking that's happening pre-weaning is actually not consistently associated with navel infections. That's one concern. Frostbitten ears is another concern. But of course, most people are concerned about udder damage. And so this one paper that has been done found that cross-sucking that persists after weaning in previously group housed calves is not actually associated with mastitis or higher somatic cell count in the first lactation. But like with all studies of health outcomes, this is really challenging to study without high sample sizes. So I think that much more research is needed, and we need to come up with solutions for cross-sucking after weaning, regardless of how calves are housed before weaning. That being said, We do want to minimize the occurrence of this behavior, and most of the research to date has focused on how we can reduce it before and during weaning. So there have been a number of studies looking at that period of the calf's life. So we know that cross-sucking is at least partially explained by hunger, not entirely. And so it is important to think about ways to reduce hunger. And so this comes back to this idea of feeding a generous volume of milk, 8 to 10 quarts a day, or even more if possible. And thinking about the weaning period when this behavior can often spike, we want to make sure that we're weaning in some kind of gradual or step down fashion and not taking milk away cold turkey. And ideally, this would be based individualized on calf starter intake. Often that's not feasible, given that in pair group housing, it's hard to determine exactly how much each calf is eating, although you can do it on an average pair group level. And so just to reiterate this point again, we know that in the industry, one of the most common recommendations is to restrict milk or milk replacer allowance to then encourage starter intake and encourage this earlier weaning timeline onto solid feed. But there's also growing evidence that this practice can have downsides towards animal welfare and other outcomes. So if calves are given the opportunity to consume as much as they want, they'll eat about twice that much. So this is when they're allowed to freely suckle from the dam or provided ad libitum or free access to milk or milk replacer. And studies have found that when they're provided these larger volumes, this can actually benefit health outcomes as well as growth performance. And we know that it also directly affects their experience of welfare. So it reduces these negative feelings of hunger. And so that's why we really encourage this, especially if pair group housing, when if you don't provide sufficient volumes of milk, you can get unwanted behaviors like cross-sucking. So in our survey, we asked, how much are people feeding to their 4-week-old calves? And we found a really encouraging outcome, which is regardless of how calves are housed, it's very common for people to be feeding 8 quarts a day or more at this age. And what you can see in the dark red bars is that those farms using pair group housing are more likely to feed 10 quarts a day or even more. And this makes sense given that there's probably been some trial and error, or they've heard of this research and know that you do need to feed these more generous quantities to reduce these unwanted behaviors. And the second thing to consider is not just how much you're feeding, but how you're feeding. So time and again, these studies have been done, including in my own lab, and we've replicated that it is important to provide milk or milk replacer through some kind of nipple instead of in an open bucket. And I think there's this common misconception that calves need to be bucket broken. Otherwise, they form or maintain a habit of suckling, and that this could lead to cross-sucking. And actually, it's the opposite that's true. So calves are going to suckle. It's an innate, highly motivated behavior for them. And so we want to think about giving them an appropriate outlet. So by feeding milk through a teat, that's one way to allow them to express that behavior appropriately. And this is especially the case with slow flow teats. It extends the length of that meal, which helps give them those fullness cues and allow them more time suckling. And actually there's suckling that happens after they finish the milk that's also important. So ideally you would leave access to those bottles or those buckets in the pen for some time afterward. We know that that requires management and isn't always feasible, but that would be a wise strategy. And we know that this suckling has important biological functions. So the action of suckling is part of what is involved in these fullness cues and also aid in proper digestion. We also know from these other studies that obtaining milk through a teat is something that calves care about. It's rewarding to them. It's something important to them. And when calves don't have this opportunity and they drink directly from open buckets, they have these indicators of stress, such as higher heart rate, and they perform more of what we call non-nutritive oral behaviors or abnormal behaviors, where they suck on objects in the pen or on each other. So in our survey, we asked people, how are you feeding your milk or milk replacer? And again, it's pretty clear that those who are pair group housing have discovered that they need to use these types of techniques. So on the right, you can see farms that use social housing, 80% of them feed milk through a teat, whereas the pattern is almost reversed among farms using individual housing. When feeding milk through a teat isn't feasible, an alternative is to provide something that can serve as a pacifier. So this can just be a blank nipple, or in the case of a recent study we did in my group, we provided a Braden bottle, which has a specialized nipple that allows starter grain to pass through. And we found that the Braden bottle did reduce cross-sucking compared to not having access to that and only having starter in an open bucket. And I do want to note all calves also had an open bucket, so we wouldn't have to train them to eat starter from that source. But this wasn't as effective as feeding milk through a slow flow teat. So I would still recommend starting with milk feeding if possible, and then using one of these pacifier type objects as a second resort. So to wrap up, a number of studies now have shown several different benefits to housing calves in pairs or groups. So I call it a win-win-win, meaning it's good for animal welfare and calf development. It's good for growth, which helps with the operations bottom line. And potentially it's also a win in the public's mind and can help with consumer confidence. In terms of housing, it's not one size fits all. There's a lot of different options available with varying levels of infrastructure investment, starting from just modifying the fencing on existing hutches all the way to building a new calf barn. And then there are some other common concerns about calf health and cross-sucking, but there are management strategies that can lead to success without individual housing. And there's more research underway, both in my group and elsewhere, on potential solutions to help improve success. So I do want to ask one more poll question before I wrap up here. So in your personal opinion, when do you think the majority of the US industry would be ready for widespread pair or group housing of calves? So the first option is now. I think we have enough success stories to serve as a blueprint. Another would be within the next 5 years or so, or within maybe the next 10 years, more than 5, less than 10 years, within the next 25 years, or within the next 50 years. Okay, I'm going to share the results. So this is really interesting. We have a few people who think, yes, the majority of the industry should be ready now. We have enough success stories to follow of producers who are already doing this. The most common response is within the next 5 years. And then the next most common response is within the next 10 years. Nobody said it should take 25 years or 50 years. And I think that that's really interesting. I gave a talk in October at the ADSA Discover conference on calves. And I had framed the talk as, in the next 10 years, we'll probably see this transition towards pair group housing. And then in the next 50 years, who knows, it may be some other system. And we got some comments in the audience saying, 10 years is too long. We're already seeing these changes happening overseas and with some organizations here in the US pushing this. And so I think that hearing your feedback is really interesting. It would be exciting if this transition happens sooner. So thanks for weighing in. Okay, so finally, as I mentioned earlier, we do have a set of resources that are freely available on my website, and we're calling it a starter guide to pairing dairy calves. And so we start in the beginning with why is there all this fuss about pair housing? So that's what the first half of my presentation was about. And then we talk about the benchmarks for calf health before that transition. And then many of these other things I listed but didn't have time to cover. So what are the best practices for hygiene, sanitation, biosecurity? What are these housing options that I went over quickly? And then grouping strategies. So what's the right age to pair calves, the age range within groups? How do you actually implement all in, all out? And then these feeding practices that I closed with to reduce cross-sucking. And then lastly, just some reminders about disbudding and dehorning, which will transition to Dr. Kehoe's talk next. So again, this is freely available. We will continue to update this as more research is done to keep this current. So I think we're saving Q&A for the end, but I will go ahead and put my email address up here. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if you have ideas for where future research is needed. So one area we know is that we need more research on the long-term effects of cross-sucking or why cross-sucking happens after weaning. So definitely reach out to me if you observe anything interesting or you have questions, and I look forward to chatting more at the end.
Thank you, Dr. Van Oss. Really appreciate you taking some time today to talk with us about this topic. A reminder, as we're kind of getting questions trickling in, we do have the Wisconsin Dairy and Beef Well-Being Conference that is going to cover many different well-being related topics. It's going to cover National Dairy Farm 4.0, fitness for transport, additional information on disbudding and pain mitigation, some information about heat stress, managing maternity cows, and genetic selection. So Feel free to take a peek at that. We'd love to see you all there. We also have an evaluation of today's speakers, and I don't think I've seen any questions in the chat yet, but I'm going to go ahead and launch this evaluation as that gives people a little bit more time to think if they've got some questions for our speakers. And then also, if we can do one more slide, we also do want to remind you that we do have the Badger Dairy Insight series. It is every other Tuesday. Our next one is going to be January 25th. We're going to be talking about diving into dairy data projects with Dr. Victor Cabrera. After that, we're going to be heading to the February 8th, and that one will be on silage quality. And then March 1st will be ins and outs of cocktail forage mixes for dairy rations. So you can get registered for those programs at our Farm Ready Research website that is shown on the bottom of this graphic and also has been dropped into our chat. And Heather, have you seen any questions come in for our speakers?
I have not yet.
Okay. All right, well, we'll give everybody just a minute or two to see if they've got any questions that come in. Oh, there we go. We've got one that came in. We had a question. Do you pair calves at birth or 3 to 10 days after birth for easy feeding until each calf can find the bottle on their own?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. So this is one where actually I would say there's not enough research to indicate the best age at pairing. So right now it's pretty flexible. Farms find a way to do what's best for them. So I think you highlighted one particular concern, and that's something that we actually encountered on our research farm where we didn't choose to pair calves at birth, where I know some farms do. And for the exact reason that you listed, which is that the farm staff wanted to make sure that each calf that was to be paired was drinking strong enough that the stronger calf wouldn't steal milk from the younger calf. They wanted to make sure they were starting on equal footing. So we did keep those age differences pretty minimal, less than a week difference. But again, we didn't pair them right at birth. But in terms of the research, I know some farms are actually hesitant to pair calves until right before weaning or even during weaning. And that's not what we're really talking about here when we do talk about pair housing. So there are a handful of studies that have shown if you pair calves earlier in life, that's where you see those best benefits in terms of growth, as well as those learning abilities. But that doesn't mean it has to be right from birth. So we're talking about the first couple of weeks of life versus right at weaning. And in parts of Europe, actually, they legislatively mandated that calves have to be paired by the time they're 2 weeks old. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the magic number. I know that here there are some farms that prefer to work with their vet until they're past the peak of the highest illness risk on their own farm. And I think that that can be a prudent decision too. So fantastic question. The jury's still out and there's no one size fits all, but I think the concern you raised is important.
Don't see any more questions. So I think, unless we get another one that comes in last minute here, I think we can go ahead and end our recording. And thank you to Dr. Van Oss for being with us today. We really appreciate your time.